She was the 11th woman sent to tame the most feared man in the territory, and the only one nobody bothered to watch arrive. While 10 beautiful brides before her had failed, while the whole of Blackstone Ridge laughed and whispered and placed bets, Alara Quinn stepped off that wagon with a worn bag, mud on her boots, and eyes that missed nothing. They thought Gideon Voss was the mystery. They were wrong. The mystery was why a man who had everything kept choosing nothing, until the morning a plain, quiet woman from nowhere looked at his valley and saw exactly what he was about to lose. Tuppa? If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this tale has traveled. And stay with me all the way to the end. You won't want to miss what comes next. The first thing most people noticed about Gideon Voss was his size. Not in the way that made women nervous, exactly. More in the way that made men recalculate. He stood 2 inches over 6 feet in his worn boots, and his shoulders had the look of someone who had spent years hauling timber and fighting weather rather than building the kind of body meant to impress anyone. His hands were scarred at the knuckles, rough at the palms, and strong enough that the blacksmith in Delwater once watched him hold a horse still for 20 minutes without a rope and said nothing for the rest of the afternoon. His beard had gone a little wild over the winter, dark shot through with early gray at 34, and his eyes were a flat, pale gray that some people found unsettling and others, mostly people who didn't know him, described as cold. The people who did know him, which was a short list, would have used a different word, careful maybe, or just watching. He had come to the Blackstone Ridge territory 11 years ago with a pack mule, a surveyor's kit he'd taught himself to use, and enough coin to register a land claim, but not enough to feel comfortable about it. The land he chose was rough and high, a long valley cut between 2 ridge lines, with a creek running through it that flooded badly in spring and froze solid by December. Everyone he talked to in those early years told him the same thing. That valley was beautiful, sure, but it was hard land, unforgiving land. You'd break yourself against it before it gave you anything back. Gideon had looked at those people, nodded politely, and gone back to his valley. By the time he was 26, the flooding problem was mostly solved through a drainage system he'd built himself over 3 summers. By 28, the main cabin was finished. Not a shack, a real structure. 2 stories, stone foundation, with a root cellar that stayed dry and a loft that stayed warm. He ran cattle on the upper slopes and kept a small orchard in the southern end of the valley where the slope caught afternoon sun. He trapped in winter and traded the pelts in Delwater, the nearest town of any consequence, a half-day's ride down from the ridge. He was not wealthy the way railroad men or land speculators were wealthy, but he was comfortable in a way that most frontier settlers spent their whole lives trying to reach and never quite managed. He owed nothing to anyone. That was the part people noticed second, after his size. Gideon Voss did not owe anyone anything, and that kind of freedom had a particular quality to it that was hard to look at directly. It was also, as it turned out, the quality that made everyone else so agitated about his personal life. The matter of Gideon's marriage, or rather his pointed refusal to pursue one, had become a running subject of conversation in Delwater by the time he was 30. People had opinions about it in the way people develop opinions about things that don't concern them, with great confidence and complete ignorance. The most popular theory was pride. He thought himself too good for ordinary women, people said. He'd built something up there in that valley, and now he sat on it like a lord on his castle, too high and mighty to come down and live like a normal man. The second most popular theory was that something had happened to him. Some past grief, a woman in another territory maybe, or a family situation nobody knew the details of. This theory was most commonly held by women in Delwater who had read a certain number of novels, and it gave Gideon a romantic quality he absolutely did not want and would have been irritated to know about. The third theory, whispered rather than stated, was darker. That there was something wrong with him, not his mind necessarily, but his character. That a man who kept to himself that completely, who turned down every overture of friendship and every social obligation the town tried to press on him, must be hiding something. What exactly was never specified, but the implication hung in the air of every conversation about him like smoke that wouldn't clear. Gideon was aware of these theories in the general way a man becomes aware of weather. You don't track it exactly, but you know when a storm's coming. He went to Delwater when he needed supplies or to settle business, stayed no longer than necessary, and rode back up to the ridge before anyone could corner him into a conversation he didn't want. The problem with this approach, which he discovered gradually, was that it left a vacuum. And people fill vacuums with whatever material is most readily available, which in a frontier town is mostly rumor. Bum. The first bride had arrived in early spring, 3 years ago. Her name was Caroline Marsh, and she had come from Farnell County at the suggestion of her cousin, who had once done trading business with a man who knew Gideon's land surveyor. The logic of this connection was so indirect that Gideon, when it was explained to him, had to ask twice to understand how Caroline had ended up standing in his doorway with a traveling trunk and an expectant expression. She was genuinely pretty. Dark hair, bright eyes, a confident way of carrying herself. She had come with what she clearly considered reasonable expectations: a husband who owned land, a home that needed a woman's touch, and perhaps some loneliness that she could address. She had not been wrong about the land or the home. She had been badly wrong about the loneliness. Gideon had looked at her for a long moment, then asked who had told her to come. She'd explained, he'd listened. Then he'd said, as neutrally as he could manage, that he hadn't arranged for anyone to come, hadn't agreed to any arrangement, and that she was welcome to shelter for the night and a meal before she headed back down to Delwater. Caroline had stared at him. "You're refusing me?" "I'm not refusing you anything," he said. "I didn't invite you." The distinction, she told people later, was not one she considered meaningful. What she told people was that he was rude, cold, and strange, and that his cabin smelled like a place where a man had been alone too long, which was true on all counts except the rude part, where reasonable people could disagree. By the time the second bride arrived, a woman named Hester, sent more formally this time by the Delwater Town Council, which had developed the idea that Gideon's bachelor status was somehow a civic problem. The story had already taken on its own momentum. People weren't just curious anymore. They were invested. Hester was turned away more quickly than Caroline had been because Gideon had by then understood that politeness in these situations was being misread as encouragement. The third, fourth, and fifth brides blurred together in the town's memory, though each was discussed individually at the time with great interest and varying degrees of sympathy. By the sixth, Delwater had started treating the whole business as entertainment. Who would go next? What would happen? How long before he finally relented? By the 10th, it had become a kind of dare. What nobody in Delwater understood, because nobody had bothered to ask and Gideon had no intention of explaining himself, was that his refusals were not about the women. Not specifically, they were about what each arrival represented. The assumption that his life had a gap in it that someone else had identified and appointed themselves to fill. Every woman who showed up at his door came carrying the weight of what other people had decided he needed, and he could feel that weight before they even spoke. It sat in the set of their shoulders, in the particular way they looked at his land as something to be claimed rather than understood. He wasn't looking for perfect. He'd never been looking for perfect. He wasn't sure what he was looking for exactly, which was part of the problem. But he knew the feeling of meeting someone who was there because they wanted to be there, as opposed to there because someone had arranged for them to be there. And so far, not one of the women who'd climbed up to Blackstone Ridge had walked through his door under their own genuine conviction. He thought about this sometimes, on the long evenings when the wind came off the upper peaks, and the cattle settled in the lower pasture and the valley got very quiet. He was not a man who talked much to himself, but he thought a great deal. And the thought he kept returning to, without quite articulating it, was that there was a difference between a person choosing and a person being sent. Every woman sent his way had been sent. He was still waiting for someone who'd chosen. He hadn't told anyone this. He didn't see how it was their business. The autumn that the 11th woman arrived was already complicated before she got there. It had started in late August with the cattle. 3 of Gideon's animals went missing from the upper pasture over the course of 2 weeks. Not all at once, which would have suggested a predator or a weather event, but one here and one there, in a pattern that felt deliberate. He found the tracks of the first one leading out of the pasture toward the eastern ridge. Then nothing. Ground too rocky to read past a certain point. The second disappeared on a night when the wind was wrong and the dogs didn't bark until it was too late to mean anything. The third he found the remnants of, far up the slope, in a place he only reached after half a day's climbing. Not killed by wolves, not fallen, but moved there. The carcass placed rather than dragged. He stood over it for a long time in the thin mountain air, working out what he was seeing. Someone had driven the animal up there and killed it in a way designed to look like a wolf kill to anyone who didn't look closely. And most people wouldn't look that closely. The terrain alone would stop them. He came back down from the ridge in a mood that even his dogs gave space. In Delwater, over the following weeks, he started paying attention to conversations he'd previously ignored. He had a way of occupying the background of a room that people forgot about. He was big enough that you'd think he'd be obvious, but he had a stillness to him that made people's eyes slide past. He heard things in the feed store and the assay office and the back room of the dry goods merchant that individually meant nothing and together meant something he wasn't ready to name. There was talk of consolidation, of a new grazing authority that would set rates for all the valley land, of men from Farnell who had money and intention and were quietly making contact with certain landowners in the region about options and arrangements. He heard the phrase voluntary sale used in a tone that made it sound less than voluntary. He didn't know who was behind it. He didn't know how far along it was. What he knew was that 3 of his cattle were dead or gone, and that the mountain above his eastern pasture was being used as a vantage point by someone who didn't want to be seen. He'd found the remnants of a camp up there, cold fire ring, some tin scraps, a piece of rope, and that something was moving through the territory that had nothing to do with weather or ordinary frontier difficulty. He was trying to work it out quietly, on his own, because that was how he worked everything. That was, as it turned out, one of the things that was about to change. Alara Quinn arrived in Delwater on a Wednesday morning in early October, on the same wagon that brought the post and a shipment of window glass from the south. The driver, whose name was Pete Alcott and who had a weakness for talking, told the story later to several different people. She'd been quiet the whole ride up from the junction, not unfriendly but not chatty either, looking out at the country with an attention that he'd found a little unnerving. Like she was memorizing it. Like she was trying to understand something about the land itself rather than just passing through it. She was not what Delwater expected. The previous brides, and by this point the arrivals had settled into a loose protocol where the woman would be received at the hotel, given a day to rest, and then transported up to Blackstone Ridge with whatever ceremony could be arranged, had all carried themselves with at least a performance of eligibility. They understood they were being evaluated and they dressed and presented accordingly. Some of them had been strikingly attractive. Most of them had been well put together. Even the ones who were nervous about it had a certain strategic awareness of the situation. Alara Quinn looked like she'd been traveling for a week and was comfortable with that. Her dress was dark gray wool, practical rather than presentable. Her hair was brown and pinned up in a way that suggested efficiency rather than style. She was not tall, not particularly small, with a build that the women of Delwater would later describe, with varying degrees of charity, as sturdy or plain, or, in the case of May Holloway, who ran the hotel and had opinions about everything, the kind of woman who doesn't bother. She was 31 years old. She had come from a farming settlement 2 territories over, and she had made the journey entirely on her own decision, after hearing about Gideon Voss through a chain of acquaintance that she explained clearly to May Holloway and that May only half listened to. What May noticed instead was the woman's eyes, dark, quick, and busy, taking in the hotel lobby, the street outside, the 2 men at the far table who were pretending not to look at her. Not anxious eyes, just working eyes. The eyes of someone who is always measuring the room. "You know what you're getting into," May said, more statement than question. "I know what I've heard," Alara said. "Which is probably different." May studied her for a moment. "He's turned away 10 women. I heard 11. 10 that actually reached him. 1 turned back before she got to the ridge." May set down her pen. "He's not going to be kind about it." "I'm not looking for kind," Alara said. "I'm looking for honest." May had no response to that, which was unusual for her. The ride up to Blackstone Ridge the following morning was made in a buckboard driven by a boy named Josiah, who was 16 and deeply awkward about the whole assignment. He'd been sent because nobody else particularly wanted to do it this time. The entertainment value of the bridal parade had worn thin enough that the trip felt more like a chore than a spectacle. Alara didn't seem to notice or care about the lukewarm send-off. She sat on the buckboard bench with her worn bag between her feet and watched the country change as they climbed. the scrub and dust of the lower valley giving way to pine and rock as the trail switched back up toward the ridge, the air getting colder and cleaner, the mountains coming into fuller view ahead. "How long has he been up here?" she asked Josiah, about halfway up. 11 years, maybe, he said. Something like that. And he built everything himself? Mostly. Hired help for some of the heavier work, but mostly himself. Josiah shot her a sideways look. "He's not going to marry you, you know. He doesn't marry anyone." "You don't know that," she said. 10 women haven't changed his mind yet," she said. "That's a different statement." Josiah chewed on this for a moment and apparently couldn't find an argument with it, because he went quiet. As they came over the last rise and the valley opened below them, Alara went still. The valley was longer than she'd expected, dropping away in a gradual slope between two pine-covered ridges, with the creek catching the morning light in the lower section, and the cabin sitting at the center of it all like something that had been placed there deliberately, with thought given to both shelter and sightlines. The orchard was bare-branched now in October, but you could see its shape, the careful arrangement of it. The upper pasture was green still, the cattle moving slowly across it. She looked at it for a long time, not in the calculating way of someone pricing property, but with something quieter than that. "It's good land," she said finally. "Good but hard," Josiah said. "The best land usually is." Gideon was splitting wood when he heard the buckboard coming down the valley trail. He knew what it meant before he could see it. He'd heard the rumors in Delwater. Another one coming, they'd said, though with less enthusiasm than before. He set down the axe and stood straight and waited with the particular expression he'd developed over the past 3 years that said, without words, that he was not pleased, but he was not going to be discourteous about it. The buckboard came around the bend in the trail. He could see the boy, Josiah, and a woman beside him. He registered what he usually registered at this point, the general impression of someone who'd made a journey, who was tired and probably carrying expectations, who would look at him and see a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be taken. He waited. The buckboard stopped about 20 feet from where he stood. Josiah climbed down from his side. The woman climbed down from hers, moving carefully on ground that was uneven from the week's rain, and she picked up her bag from the bed of the buckboard and stood there for a moment with it in her hand, looking not at him, but at the woodpile. "That's a good axe," she said. He blinked. "What?" "She tights." "The axe." She nodded at it. "Single bit. You can tell by how it's worn on the pole. You're using it right, not overstriking. A lot of men overstrike and wear out the handle." She shifted her gaze to him. "Alara Quinn." He realized after a half-second that she'd introduced herself. "Gideon Voss. I know." She looked around the yard. The cabin, the woodpile, the tool shed with its door slightly off plumb, the water barrel near the south wall. Her eyes moved the way the eyes of someone move when they're not just looking but counting. "I'd like to talk to you, Mr. Voss. Not—" She made a brief, vague gesture that somehow encompassed all 10 of her predecessors. "Not about any of that specifically. About the valley." He looked at her. "The valley. There's a camp on your eastern ridge," she said. "Cold but recent. And the supply road from the South Junction has been rerouted twice in the past month. I noticed it coming up. Cutbacks in the road itself, not weather damage. That's deliberate work." She held his gaze. "Someone's been moving around up here and they don't want to be seen doing it. I thought you'd want to know if you didn't already." There was a silence that lasted long enough for Josiah, still standing by the buckboard, to become visibly uncomfortable. Gideon studied Alara Quinn. She stood there and let him look, not shifting her weight, not filling the silence with nervous words. The bag hung from her hand like it wasn't heavy, which he suspected meant she'd been carrying bags like that most of her life. "How do you know it was deliberate work?" he said. "On the road." "The cut angle," she said. "Weather damage breaks irregular. Deliberate cutting leaves a consistent angle, even when they're trying to make it look like weather. My father was a road surveyor for 12 years. I grew up learning to read road damage." She paused. "I noticed 3 separate cuts on the way up here. 2 within a mile of each other, which suggests a specific section they wanted to disrupt rather than just general difficulty." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put coffee on." Josiah's mouth opened slightly. He closed it again. The interior of the cabin surprised her. A little, though she tried not to show it. She'd expected a bachelor's disorder. The specific chaos of a man who'd lived alone long enough to stop seeing the mess. What she found instead was a functional austerity that was almost meticulous, not because someone had cleaned for her arrival, but because things had been put where they were put and left there, and the habit had accumulated into a kind of severe order. The table was big and scarred and clean. The tools hung on the wall in a row that made sense, by size, by use. Books were stacked on a shelf near the fireplace. A surveying manual, a farming almanac, two others whose spines she couldn't read from where she stood. He moved around the kitchen end of the room with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who cooked for himself every day and had stopped thinking about it. She set her bag down near the door and sat at the table without being told to, because waiting to be invited to sit in a working kitchen was a form of performance she'd never had patience for. "The cattle," she said. "Have you lost more than what you reported to the trading post?" He turned from the stove and looked at her. "How do you know I reported anything?" "You would have. If you lost animals and you didn't report it, you'd have no record if it became a legal question later. You're careful." She looked at the surveying manual on the shelf. "You planned this place carefully. You'd report the losses." He turned back to the stove. "3, he said after a moment, and signs of someone using the upper ridge as a vantage point. "For how long?" "Since mid-August, near as I can tell." She was quiet, working through something. He brought 2 cups to the table and set them down, then sat across from her, and she looked at the coffee for a moment before wrapping her hands around the cup, which was hot enough to be useful on a cold morning. "There's a man in Delwater," she said. "Name of Crane. Do you know him?" "Harlan Crane. He runs the assay office." "He does," she said. "He also received 2 visitors from Farnell County in the past week. I watched them arrive at the hotel the day I got in. They met with Crane and with Bodell Fitch, the man who does title recordings." "Fitch." Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. "What kind of meeting?" "I don't know the specifics, but Crane was nervous coming out of it, and Fitch wasn't. That's an interesting distribution." She looked at him directly. "Someone's interested in this valley, specifically, and they have someone inside Delwater who's either helping them or has been convinced it's in their interest to." The fire popped in the hearth. Gideon looked at his coffee without drinking it. "You noticed all of this," he said, "in a day." "I notice things," she said. "Not boasting, just reporting." "Why?" He met her eyes. "Why come up here and tell me this instead of—" He gestured loosely. "Whatever else you came to do." She looked at him steadily. "Because what I came to do and this are the same thing, Mr. Voss. I came because someone told me there was a man up here who'd built something worth keeping and was about to lose it because he didn't know what was moving around him. I thought that was information worth carrying." She paused. "And I thought that a man who'd held on to this land for 11 years through every kind of difficulty probably deserved to know." He said nothing for a moment. "Who told you that?" he said. "A woman named Verna Alcott, Pete Alcott's aunt. She does trading out of the South Junction, and she hears things from the Farnell side." Elora set down her cup. "She was worried. I was already looking for a reason to head west, so I came." Just like that. "Not just like that," she said with a trace of something dry. "It was 2 weeks of travel and one very cold mountain road. Nothing about it was just." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite. The nearest she could describe it, later, was that his face shifted the way a landscape shifts when a cloud passes over the sun, revealing detail that the flat light had been hiding. "You'll need a place to stay while we work this out," he said. "The loft's decent. There's a curtain." She nodded once. "I'll cook," she said. "And I'd like to look at your land records when you have time. Survey maps especially, if you have them." "I have them." "Good." She reached for her coffee again. "Then let's start there. Bam." What they found in the survey maps that first evening, spread across Gideon's scarred table with a lamp pulled close, was the beginning of an answer they didn't yet know they were looking for. The valley land, Gideon's parcel, along with 6 other smaller claims held by settlers who'd come to the region over the past decade, formed a corridor. Not obviously, not on a single claim map, but laid out together, the way Elora insisted on doing it, spreading his maps and the county records she'd brought copies of from the Delwater Land Office, The shape of it became visible. From the south junction to the upper ridge, the valley created a natural pass through what was otherwise impassable mountain terrain. Anyone who controlled the land in that corridor controlled the most viable trade route between the eastern settlements and the mining country to the northwest, an advantage that would be worth considerable money as the territory developed, and that was currently worth nothing only because none of the individual landowners had understood what they collectively possessed. "Someone from Farnell figured it out," Alara said, tracing the corridor with her finger. "And now they're buying," Gideon said. "Or trying to. Or pressuring." She looked at him. "If they can't buy, they make it hard enough that people sell anyway. Disrupt supply routes, damage livestock, create the impression that the land isn't viable. Then offer a price that looks reasonable compared to the alternative." Gideon sat back. His face was closed in the way of a man doing calculations. "The Lindqvist claim is at the south end of the corridor. 2 months ago, Sven Lindqvist told me he was thinking about heading back east. Was that unusual for him? He'd said the opposite every time I talked to him for 8 years. Alara looked at the map. "What about the others? Pryor sold last spring. I thought it was just—" He stopped. "I thought it was just a decision." "Maybe it was," she said. "Maybe not." She straightened up from the table and rubbed the back of her neck. Outside, the wind had come up off the peaks, and the cabin structure made its cold weather sounds, the small protests of wood and stone against temperature change. "Someone's been patient about this, and patient people are usually planning further ahead than you'd expect." Gideon looked at her across the lamp. In the warm light, she was less plain than he'd registered at first. There was a quality to her attention that changed the whole character of her face, made it interesting in the way that faces become interesting when the person behind them is genuinely thinking. "You've done this before," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Done what?" "Worked something out like this. The road cuts, the distribution of anxiety between Crane and Fitch, the corridor." He paused. "You moved through this like someone who knew the pattern." She was quiet for a moment. "My father's land," she said finally. "Different circumstances, different territory, but some of the same moves." Her voice didn't change much, but something shifted behind it. "We didn't figure it out in time." He didn't ask what had happened to the land. She didn't offer it. "We're figuring it out now," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "We are." The days that followed had a strange quality to them. The intimacy of shared work in a small space, with the particular awkwardness of two people who were neither strangers nor anything else yet, trying to navigate around each other without making it a production. She was up before him, which surprised him. He'd always been early, and he arrived in the kitchen the second morning to find the fire already built and coffee on, and Alara standing at the south window watching the lower pasture with her cup in both hands, still in her coat from having gone outside to check something. "Dog was restless at 4, she said, without turning around. "I went out to look. Nothing in the yard, but there was light on the eastern ridge. Moving. Someone with a lantern." He came to stand beside her at the window. The ridge was dark now, in the early gray light. "How long did it stay?" "Maybe 20 minutes, moving north to south along the ridge line, then nothing." She looked at her coffee. "They're surveying the ridge, or they're communicating with someone on the other side of it." He thought about that for a moment, looking at the ridge. His skyline, the rock face he'd been looking at for 11 years. "I'm going to ride up this morning," he said. "I'll come." He looked at her. She looked back, and the expression on her face was not a challenge, exactly, but it was not a request for permission either. It was the face of someone who had already made a decision and was simply informing him of it. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't object. The eastern ridge, in the cold morning, gave up more than he'd expected. Alara found the second camp before he did. She had an eye for the particular pattern of disturbed ground that indicated habitation, the way small things got moved and broken by routine rather than by weather. The camp was in a narrow shelf of rock screened by a stand of stunted pine, with sightlines down into the valley and south along the trail. Someone had been here recently enough that the packed dirt still held boot impressions. 2 men, Gideon said, crouching to look. "Maybe 3. 2, she said. "Same pair of boots, 2 different sizes, coming back multiple times. See the repetition in the heel pattern there?" She pointed. 3 people move differently. There's a weight distribution in how 2 people share a camp versus 3. He stared at the boot impressions for a moment and then looked up at her. My father taught me tracking, he said. And you know things about tracking that he didn't. My mother was better at it than my father, she said, already moving along the shelf to look at the sight lines. She never got credit for it. He stood and followed her to the edge of the shelf, where the valley lay below them in the morning light, the cabin and outbuildings small and distinct, the creek catching the sun. You can see everything from here, he said. Yes. She turned to look at him, and someone's been seeing it. There was something uncomfortable about that. The valley had always felt private, a space that was his by position and effort and the simple difficulty of getting to it. The idea of eyes up here on this rock, watching his cattle and his cabin and his daily patterns, produced a particular anger in him that was quieter and colder than the ordinary kind. We need to know who they're connected to in Delwater, he said. Crane, she said, probably Fitch, possibly others. She paused, looking at the valley. You'll need to talk to the other landholders in the corridor, Lindqvist, the Pryor family, if you can reach them, anyone else who's had difficulties in the past year. They'll think I'm being paranoid. Maybe, she said, or they've had their own difficulties and they've been sitting on them because they didn't want to seem paranoid either. She gave him a brief, dry look. People who are isolated tend to assume their problems are theirs alone. That's the bet someone's making. He considered that. Below, one of his dogs was moving along the creek bank, nose down, following something interesting. You've been here 3 days, he said. Yes, and you've already made yourself... He stopped, trying to find the right word. Not useful, something more specific. Necessary. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had something careful in it. I don't want to be necessary, Mr. Voss. I want this to matter. There's a difference. He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the pines around them with a low, continuous sound, and the valley below held its shape and its light, and he stood on the ridge above it all and tried to understand the difference she was describing, and found that he could. Gideon, he said. She looked at him. Not Mr. Voss, he said. There's no one up here to perform formality for. She nodded once, a small, unremarkable nod that nonetheless felt like something settling. All right, she said. Gideon? They stood there for a moment longer, looking at the valley, before they started down. The nights were the hardest part, in a different way than the days. Not because of any tension between them. Nothing like that. Not yet. And perhaps it would have been simpler if there had been something obvious to deal with. What made the evenings difficult was the quality of quiet that fell over the cabin after the work of the day was done, when they'd eaten and cleaned up and sat at opposite ends of the table with the lamp between them. She read. She'd brought 2 books in that worn bag, which he hadn't expected, and she worked through them with the focused attention she gave everything. He went over his survey maps or the land records, cross-referencing, looking for patterns. What made it difficult was that the quiet was not uncomfortable. He'd spent 11 years in this cabin, and the quiet had always been his, a thing he'd shaped to fit himself, made livable through habit. And now there was someone else in the quiet with him, and the quiet had not been disturbed by her presence. It had simply expanded, made room. He was not sure what to do with that. He was discovering, sure of several things he'd considered settled. On the 4th night, she looked up from her book and said without any preamble, the man who organized all of this, whoever's behind Crane and Fitch and the surveyors on the ridge, he's going to want to move soon, before winter makes the ridge inaccessible. Gideon looked up. How soon? A month, maybe 6 weeks. She set the book down. Which means whatever he's planning with the other landholders, he needs to bring it to a head at the autumn gathering. The autumn gathering in Delwater was a tradition, a combined trading day and social occasion, the last major event before winter set the territory back on its heels. Everyone came. It was the kind of event at which decisions got made and announced, because there was no better audience. He'll make his move at the gathering, Gideon said. Or someone will make it for him, she said. And it won't look like a move. It'll look like an opportunity. A neighbor in trouble, a fair offer, a chance to get out before things get harder. She paused. It's much more effective than a threat. He looked at her across the lamp. What do we do about it? She met his gaze. We figure out who's pulling the strings before we get to that room, and we make sure the other landholders know what they're being asked to give up. She was quiet for a moment. They'll need to understand the corridor, see it the way we saw it on the maps. Right now, every one of them is looking at their own piece of land. They can't see the shape of what it is together. He nodded slowly. That's going to take time. We have maybe 3 weeks before the gathering. Her jaw set slightly. It's tight. It's very tight. She picked up her book again. Then we'd better not waste any of it. He looked at the survey map in front of him. The valley, the corridor, the shape of what he'd built and what it might become, for good or for ill. Outside, the wind came off the peaks as it always did at this hour, and the cabin made its familiar sounds, and the lamp cast its circle of warm light between them. He'd spent 11 years building something in this valley, and not understanding until 4 days ago how clearly someone else could see it. And he'd spent the same 11 years in this cabin and not understanding until 4 days ago that the quiet here had room for more than one person. He wasn't ready to say what that meant, but he knew what it felt like sitting here working beside someone who was as serious about this valley as he was, who had come here out of genuine concern rather than expectation, who noticed things he'd missed and said so without making him feel small about it. It felt, for the first time in 11 years, like something he might not want to do alone. He went back to his maps and did not say this, because he was not a man who said things he wasn't ready to mean. But he thought it, in the careful and deliberate way he thought everything, and let it settle in among the other things he knew. The ride down to the Lindqvist claim took the better part of a morning, following the creek south through the section of the valley where the pines thinned and the slope gentled into something almost hospitable. Gideon had made this ride enough times that his horse knew the trail without much direction, which left him free to think, something he was doing more of lately, and in directions he hadn't anticipated. Alara rode beside him on the second horse, a broad-backed roan mare named August who had a stubborn streak and a tendency to test new riders. She'd figured August out in about 10 minutes on their first morning ride, making no particular fuss about it, just sitting deep and patient until the mare stopped arguing and accepted the situation. Gideon had watched this from the corner of his eye and said nothing. They didn't talk much on the trail. That was one of the things he was adjusting to, that her silences weren't the same as other people's silences. Most people who went quiet were either bored or waiting for something. She went quiet because she was thinking, and the thinking had a particular texture to it that he was starting to recognize. Her eyes would settle on the middle distance, and her jaw would set slightly, and you could nearly see her working through something, turning it like a problem in her hands. He'd caught himself watching for that expression more than was strictly necessary. He's going to be defensive, Gideon said, when the Lindqvist fence line came into view. Sven doesn't take well to being told he's missed something. Most people don't, she said. He especially doesn't. He came out here from the old country 20 years ago and built that place from nothing, and he's got the kind of pride that goes with that. He paused. Don't lead with what we know. Let him talk first. She glanced at him. I wasn't planning to lead with anything. I was planning to listen. He nodded, slightly chastened, and said nothing more. Sven Lindqvist was in his yard when they arrived, patching a section of fence with the focused irritability of a man who had been at it longer than he'd expected. He was in his 60s, compact and weathered. With a white beard he kept short and hands that were as scarred as Gideon's. He looked up when they rode in, and his expression cycled through recognition and caution before settling on something neutral. Voss, he said. He looked at Alara without greeting her. Sven. Gideon dismounted. This is Alara Quinn. She's been staying up at the ridge. Sven looked at her for a moment. Another one, he said, flat. Another what? Alara said from the horse. Woman they send up there to... He made a hand gesture that was dismissive in any language. Nobody sent me, she said. She swung down from August with the same economy of movement she used for everything. I came because Verna Alcott told me the South Corridor was being targeted, and I thought someone should tell Mr. Voss about it. She met Lindqvist's eyes. Have you had trouble with livestock this season? He stiffened. What kind of trouble? Missing animals. Sick ones that shouldn't have gotten sick. Anything that felt wrong in a way you couldn't explain. A long silence. Sven Lindqvist set down his fence tool and looked at the ground for a moment, and when he looked up, something in his face had changed. Not softened, exactly, but opened. 2 calves in July, he said. Never found them. And my creek intake was blocked in August. Rocks in it, packed in a way that doesn't happen natural. He paused. I thought it was boys. Stupid frontier trouble. It wasn't boys, Ilara said. They stayed 2 hours at the Lindqvist place, long enough for Sven to pour coffee, then something stronger when the conversation got to the corridor and the maps and the shape of what they were all sitting on without knowing it. Long enough for his wife Britta to come in from the kitchen and stand with her arms crossed, listening with an expression that went from skeptical to worried to grimly certain in the space of about 20 minutes. Pryor sold in the spring, Sven said. I thought he was tired. He'd been talking about his daughter in Ohio. Maybe that was part of it, Gideon said, but someone made it easier for him to decide to go. Harlan Crane handled the paperwork, Britta said, from the corner where she'd settled. Her voice was careful and precise, the voice of someone who'd been holding a thought for a while. He came out here too, last spring, asking about our plans, whether we were thinking of staying long term. She looked at her husband. I told you it was strange. Sven made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't disagreement either. Who bought the Pryor claim? Ilar asked. A land company, Gideon said. Out of Farnell. I looked it up at the time because... He stopped. I didn't look into it far enough. The name of the company? Bellrock Holdings. He looked at her. You know it? I know the name behind it, she said. Verna mentioned it. A man named Aldous Reeve. He runs a resource investment operation out of Farnell. He's been buying corridor land in 2 other territories over the past 4 years. She paused. In one of them, he bought enough to control the trade route and then set tolls. The landholders who didn't sell ended up essentially paying rent to move their own goods. The room was quiet for a moment. He's doing the same thing here, Sven said. Not a question. He will be if he gets enough of the corridor. Sven looked at Gideon. How much does he have? The Pryor claim puts him at the south end. He's got a small parcel on the North Ridge. I didn't know it was connected until we laid the maps out. Gideon leaned forward, elbows on the table. If he gets your land and mine, he doesn't need anything else. The route is his. Sven was quiet for a long time. Britta had stopped standing with her arms crossed and was sitting now, her hands flat on the table. He came to see me, Sven said, finally. In September. A man representing Bellrock. Said they were interested in the land as investment property, offered a fair price. He rubbed his face. I said I wasn't selling. He said to think about it. The conditions in the territory were going to get harder before they got easier. His voice was steady, but there was something under it. I thought it was just a businessman talking. It was a warning, Ilara said quietly, dressed up as advice. Sven looked at her. You're very certain about things for someone who's been here a week. I've seen this pattern before, she said. I'm certain about the pattern. I'm less certain about the details. She met his gaze. But I'm certain enough to be here. He studied her for a long moment with the thorough attention of a man who'd spent a lifetime evaluating reliability in other people and had learned the hard way what unreliable looked like. All right, he said, what do you need from me? They got back to the ridge after dark, cold and tired, the horse's breath steaming in the night air as they came down the last section of trail. Ilara fed August while Gideon handled his own horse, and they worked in the easy quiet that had developed between them over the past week, each knowing what needed doing, neither getting in the other's way. Inside, she put together a meal from what was in the cold store while he built up the fire. It was a practical division that had arrived without negotiation, which was either a good sign or simply the path of least resistance, and she hadn't decided which. Reeve's going to move before the gathering, she said, setting a plate in front of him. Now that we've talked to Lindqvist, if Crane is his man in Delwater, he might hear about it. You think Lindqvist will talk? Not intentionally, but Britta went into town yesterday. She mentioned it when I asked about the creek intake. She was at the dry goods store. Ilara sat down across from him. Crane's wife works there 2 days a week. Gideon looked at her. You asked about the creek intake. I was curious how recently it had been blocked, but she mentioned the shopping trip unprompted. She picked up her fork. I'm not saying Crane will definitely hear. I'm saying we should assume he might. He ate without speaking for a moment. The food was plain. Beans, salt pork, some dried apples she'd reconstituted with water and a little vinegar. But it was hot, and it was good, which he hadn't fully expected. He'd been cooking for himself long enough that he'd forgotten what it was like when someone else thought about it. "We need to talk to Wren Calder," he said. "She holds the middle section of the corridor, the parcel that sits between my northern boundary and the upper pass. I've had no trouble with her, but she's alone up there, and her operation is small." He paused. "If they lean on her, she might not have the resources to push back." "How old?" 40, maybe. Widow. Came out here with her husband 7 years ago and stayed when he died." He glanced up. "Strong woman, but isolated." "People who are isolated make decisions in a vacuum," Alara said. "If Reeves' men have already been talking to her, she might have a very different picture of her situation than what's actually true." "I'll write up tomorrow." "We'll write up tomorrow," she said. He didn't argue. "Welcome." Wren Calder's place was smaller than either the Voss or Lindqvist properties. A single-story cabin on a rocky bench above the tree line, with a goat pen and a kitchen garden that was already finished for the season, and a view that on a clear day was extraordinary and on a cold day was simply brutal. She was outside when they arrived, mending a section of roof with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned to make repairs last, because she couldn't afford to make them twice. She climbed down when she saw them and stood with her arms at her sides, watching them approach with an expression that Alara read as wariness rather than unfriendliness. "Gideon Voss," she said. "It's been a while." "It has," he said. "I should have come sooner." She looked at Alara. "And you're the one they're all talking about in town." "Probably," Alara said. "What are they saying?" A small, complicated expression crossed Wren Calder's face. Something between amusement and sympathy. "That you're plain and stubborn, and you won't last the winter." She paused. "May Holloway says you've got good eyes, which from May is practically a love letter." "Then May's more perceptive than most," Alara said, and Wren's expression shifted fully into something warmer. "Come inside," Wren said. "You can tell me why you've really come." Inside, the cabin was lived in the particular way of someone who had made peace with solitude, things placed for function rather than appearance, a few objects that were clearly kept for reasons beyond utility. A small painting on the wall, somewhat faded. A good lamp in the center of the table, evidence of someone who had decided that living alone didn't require living badly. Alara told her about the corridor clearly and without drama, laying out what they knew and what they suspected, watching Wren's face the whole time. Wren listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and when Alara finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "A man came to see me," Wren said, 6 weeks ago. He said he represented a land investment company, and they were interested in buying the parcel for grazing rights. She lifted her eyes. "He offered twice what I paid for it." "That sounds generous," Gideon said carefully. "It does," Wren said. "That's what bothered me about it." She looked between them. "A man offers you twice what a piece of land is worth, and calls it fair market value. Either he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he knows something you don't." Her jaw set. "I told him I needed to think. He said to take my time, but that the offer had a window, and the window was going to close around the time of the gathering." "He gave you a deadline tied to the gathering," Alara said. "Yes." "That's not a coincidence." Alara looked at Gideon, then back at Wren. "He'll be in Delwater for the gathering. He's planning to close as many deals as he can that weekend, while everyone's together and the social pressure is working in his favor." She paused. "And if he can't close deals, I think he'll try something else." "What kind of something else?" Wren asked. "I don't know yet," Alara said honestly. "But the men on the ridge and the disrupted supply roads aren't the work of a patient negotiator. Someone's prepared to push harder than a fair offer if the fair offer doesn't work." Wren looked at her steadily. "Are you asking me not to sell?" "I'm asking you to know what you're selling," Alara said, "and what it's worth, not the number on the offer, the actual worth." She paused. "That's your decision to make, but I'd rather you made it with the full picture." Wren Calder was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the rocks above the bench in a high, thin sound. One of the goats knocked against the pen wall. "My husband chose this land," Wren said, finally. "He picked it out of 20 parcels because of where it sat. Because he could see 3 different mountain faces from the kitchen window." She looked out the small window above the sink where those same mountain faces were visible in the cold afternoon light. "He was dead 4 months after we built that cabin. And I stayed. She turned back to them. I stayed because this was the thing we'd chosen together, and I wasn't ready to let someone else decide what it was worth. Neither Gideon nor Alara spoke. I'll be at the gathering, Ren said, and I won't be signing anything. Boss. On the ride back down the mountain, the light was going fast, the peaks cutting off the sun earlier than it felt like it should. Alara rode a little ahead on August, who had decided she approved of mountain trails even if she still had opinions about everything else. 3 of us now, Gideon said, Lindqvist, Calder, and my parcel. That's the core of the corridor. It won't be enough on its own, Alara said. We need Delwater on our side, not just the landholders, the town itself. Reeve's going to present this as progress. Development. Good for the territory. She glanced back at him. If people believe that, holding the corridor land starts to look like obstruction. And what do we do about that? She was quiet for a moment, thinking in that way she thought. We need to know who Crane is working with. Fitch, we suspect, but suspicion isn't enough. She paused. And we need to understand exactly what they're planning to propose at the gathering. If we're walking in blind, we're already behind. I might be able to find out, he said. There's a man in Delwater, Roy Sutter. He runs the freight operation. He's been at the gathering committee every year for 15 years. If Crane is trying to put something on the agenda, Roy will know about it. Can you trust him? Gideon thought about Roy Sutter. His particular combination of nosiness and integrity, his hatred of being left out of anything important. He's not going to protect Crane if he thinks Crane is doing something crooked, he said. Roy's got his faults, but dishonesty isn't one of them. Then talk to him before the gathering. I'll go down to Delwater in 2 days. She nodded. They rode in silence for a while, the trail descending through the pines, the creek audible somewhere below them before it came into view. You know, Gideon said, not quite looking at her, when you first rode up to my place, I thought... He stopped. You thought I was another one they'd sent, she said. Yes. You were halfway right, she said, without any particular heat. Verna sent me. But Verna sent me because she thought someone needed to know about the corridor, not because she thought you needed a wife. A pause. The 2 things happened to overlap. They did, he said. Another silence. Below them, the creek appeared through the trees, quick and cold, gray in the failing light. I'm not good at... He stopped again, which was unusual for him, because he was generally careful about speaking only when he knew what he was going to say. I'm not good at letting things in, he said finally. Into the work, into the place. She didn't look back at him. I know, she said. I don't mean it as... Gideon. Her voice was easy. I know. You've been alone up here for 11 years, and you built everything yourself, and you have good reasons for all of it. She shifted her weight slightly in the saddle as August navigated a rocky section of trail. I'm not trying to change that. I'm trying to help you keep it. He said nothing for a moment. The last light was leaving the upper peaks, the sky behind them going a deep, cold blue. I know you are, he said. They came down off the trail and into the valley in the near dark, the cabin windows showing lamplight that one of them had left burning that morning, and the dogs came out to meet them, and they put the horses up and went inside, and the quiet of the cabin settled around both of them without being asked. It was not a comfortable situation. It was not simple or easy or headed anywhere he could clearly see. But it was, he was beginning to understand, real in a way that 11 years of chosen solitude had not prepared him for. He was not sure what to do with real, but he was, for the first time in a long time, willing to find out. Roy Sutter turned out to be exactly what Gideon had described, a man whose nosiness and integrity existed in genuine tension with each other, so that when you put the right information in front of him, both qualities fired at once. Gideon had found him at the freight office on the main street of Delwater, going over manifests with the focused unhappiness of a man who'd found a discrepancy and couldn't locate it. He'd listened to Gideon's account of Bellrock Holdings and Aldous Reeve and the corridor land with his pen still in his hand, not writing, not moving, just listening with the particular stillness of someone who is recalibrating. When Gideon finished, Roy set his pen down. Crane brought a proposal to the gathering committee 2 weeks ago, he said. He called it a territory development initiative, said a Farnell investment group wanted to sponsor a new road grading project through the valley, Improve the southern trade route, make it viable year-round. He paused. He said the company would fund the whole thing in exchange for certain access rights along the corridor. Access rights, Gideon said. That's the language he used. I asked what it meant specifically, and he said the details would be presented at the gathering, that it was complex and needed the right setting. Roy's jaw was tight. I thought it was vague. I said so. He said I was being obstructive. He looked at Gideon. I don't like Harlan Crane, but I thought it was just the usual land development talk. I didn't think... He stopped. You didn't know what you were looking at, Gideon said. Not an accusation. No. Roy picked up his pen, set it down again. Is what you're describing, is it solid, or is it possible you're wrong? Gideon thought about Alara at the table with the survey maps, tracing the corridor, her finger moving with the quiet certainty of someone reading a language they'd learned the hard way. It's solid, he said. Roy was quiet for a long moment. What do you need? I need to know if Crane gets word that we've been talking to the corridor landholders, if he changes anything about the committee agenda, or if strangers start moving through town, men who look like hired work rather than settlers. I can watch for that, Roy said. He wasn't happy about any of it, which was the right response. A man who was cheerful about this kind of news wasn't a man you could trust with it. Gideon rode back up to the ridge that evening, carrying the shape of what was coming more clearly than before. Crane had already embedded a proposal in the gathering agenda. Whatever Reeve was planning, it had a formal structure, a presentation, a vote, perhaps a document to be signed in front of witnesses. It would look like civic progress. It would look like the territory taking care of itself. He told Alara that night. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when he finished, she sat for a moment with her hands around her coffee cup, not drinking. He's not just buying land, she said. He's buying legitimacy. If the gathering votes to approve the access rights, it becomes a community decision. The individual landholders who don't want to sell look like they're opposing the will of the town. Exactly. Then we need to get ahead of the vote. She looked at him. The corridor landholders need to be in that room with the full picture, and they need to be ready to speak before Crane's proposal is presented. Once it's framed as progress, it's very hard to reframe it as theft without looking like you're the problem. The gathering is in 8 days. Then we have 8 days. But they were not easy days. The work of the next week was the unglamorous kind, writing to 3 more small claims on the edges of the corridor, sitting in strangers' kitchens explaining things that were complicated and required trust that hadn't been established, answering questions they couldn't fully answer, managing the particular anxiety of people who had built their lives on land that was now revealed to be more contested than they'd known. One family, the Norrises, were frightened enough that they spent most of the conversation looking for reasons not to believe it. Another man, a stubborn Scotsman named Fergus McRae, who held a narrow parcel on the northern end, was angry in the indiscriminate way of someone who needs a target and keeps choosing the nearest one, which was Gideon. You come here now, McRae said, standing in his doorway with his arms crossed. After 11 years of wanting nothing to do with any of us, and you want me to trust your word about what's happening to my land? I'm not asking you to trust my word, Gideon said. I'm asking you to look at the maps. I've seen maps. Not these maps laid next to each other. Gideon held his gaze. Give me 20 minutes, McRae. If it doesn't make sense when you see it, I'll leave and not come back. A long, hostile silence. McRae looked past Gideon to Alara, who was standing slightly to the side and had not yet spoken. Who's she? He said. The person who figured this out, Gideon said. McRae studied her with the frank, assessing look of a man who'd decided long ago that being polite was less useful than being accurate. Alara met it without flinching, without performing anything, just standing there with the survey maps under her arm and the cold at her back. 20 minutes, McRae said, and stepped aside. He ended up giving them 2 hours. By the end of it, he was angry in a more focused and useful direction. Alara handled each conversation differently, which Gideon noticed and filed away. With the frightened Norrises, she was slow and careful, laying things out in small pieces and letting each one settle before adding the next. With McRae, she was direct to the point of bluntness, which was the only currency he respected. With an elderly widow named Consolata Varga, who held a thin strip of land at the corridor's narrowest point and who had more intelligence in her quiet eyes than most people gave her credit for, Alara sat down and said nothing for a full minute before the older woman spoke first, and then the conversation went somewhere that Gideon hadn't expected and that covered ground he hadn't known needed covering. He asked about it on the ride home. What did she tell you? That Bodell Fitch came to her 3 months ago and offered to help her update her land records. Said there were some filing irregularities that could cause trouble if she didn't address them. Alara's voice was measured. She let him. She thought he was doing her a favor. Gideon understood immediately. He altered something. I think he created a gap in her title chain, something small enough that she wouldn't notice, significant enough that it could be used to challenge her claim if they needed leverage. She paused. She's been uneasy about it ever since, but she didn't know what she was uneasy about. Can we fix it? I looked at the copy she kept. There's an original filing from 7 years ago that contradicts whatever Fitch added. If we bring both documents to the gathering and present them in the right order publicly, it exposes what Fitch did. She was quiet for a moment. It also means Fitch is going to know we're coming. Good, Gideon said. She looked at him sideways. You want him to know? I want him scared, Gideon said. Scared people make mistakes. She considered this. That's true, she said. It's also a little cold-blooded. He altered a widow's land records, Gideon said flatly. I'm comfortable with cold-blooded. The night before the gathering, Gideon did something he hadn't planned to do and wasn't entirely sure about even as he was doing it. He'd been up late going over the documents they'd assembled, the survey maps, Consulata Vargas filing records, the notes from each conversation with the corridor landholders, a rough accounting of the timeline of Bellrock Holdings' activity in the territory. Alara had gone up to the loft an hour earlier, tired in the bone-deep way of someone who'd been running on will for too long. He sat at the table after the lamp burned low and thought about the gathering, and about what came after the gathering, and about the shape of the weeks they'd spent together in this cabin. The working silences and the difficult conversations, and the evening when she'd laughed at something August had done in the yard, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and how he'd stood there listening to it like a man hearing a sound he hadn't known he missed. He thought about 10 women he'd sent away and understood now what had been wrong with each situation, which was not the women themselves, but the fact that none of them had wanted the actual life he lived. They'd wanted the land, or the stability, or the version of him they'd constructed from rumor before they arrived. Not one of them had looked at the valley the way Alara had looked at it from the top of that rise on her first morning, with the eyes of someone seeing a thing clearly and finding it worth the seeing. He thought about what Alara had said on the ridge. I'm not trying to change that. I'm trying to help you keep it. He stayed at the table a long time. The gathering in Delwater was held in the main freight warehouse, which was the only building in town large enough to accommodate the kind of attendance the autumn event drew. By mid-morning, it was crowded. Settlers from the surrounding land, traders passing through, the permanent residents of Delwater itself, children underfoot and dogs outside, the smell of wood smoke and bodies, and the particular energy of people who'd been isolated for weeks and were now suddenly required to be social. Gideon arrived with Alara and Ren Calder and Sven Lindqvist, a configuration that drew immediate notice. People looked at them coming through the door and then looked at each other. He felt the ripple of it move through the room and ignored it with the practice of someone who'd been the subject of other people's attention for 3 years. What he couldn't ignore was Harlan Crane, who stood at the far end of the room near the committee table and who saw them come in and went very still in the way of a man doing rapid calculations. Beside him was Bodell Fitch, who was less contained about it. His eyes went to Alara and stayed there with an expression that was not quite recognition, but something close to alarm. Roy Sutter appeared at Gideon's elbow within 2 minutes. Crane added something to the agenda this morning, he said, low. He's moved the Bellrock presentation to the top. First item. He wants it done before people have time to think, Alara said, equally low. Then we need to get there first, Gideon said. The gathering came to order with the usual preliminary business, territory news, acknowledgement of new arrivals, the traditional reading of the land registry updates. Gideon watched the room while this proceeded. He could feel the social gravity of it, the way the crowd had already sorted itself, with certain men clustered near Crane and Fitch, men he recognized now as part of the arrangement, faces he'd seen in the background of various Delwater conversations over the past year. 4 of them, maybe 5. Not many, but positioned correctly, they could shape a room's opinion the way a few large stones can change the course of a creek. Crane stood to open his presentation. He was a smooth man when he chose to be. Nothing particularly distinctive about him, a quality that turned out to be useful in a man doing this kind of work. He started talking about the territory's future, about the opportunity that development represented, about the road grading project that a generous Farnell investment group was prepared to fund at no cost to the community. He got about 4 sentences in. "I have a question about the access rights," Ilara said. It was not loud. She didn't shout, but the room was quiet enough that her voice carried clearly, and it had a quality to it that made people stop what they were doing and locate her. Crane stopped, found her in the crowd. His face did something careful. "Ma'am, there'll be time for questions. I'd like to understand the terms before you go further," she said. "The access rights that Bell Rock Holdings is requesting in exchange for the roadwork. I'd like to hear the specific language." A ripple through the crowd. People looking at her, then at Crane, then at each other. "That's a reasonable request," Roy Sutter said from across the room. Crane's smooth expression held. "The specifics are detailed in the proposal document, which will circulate. The access rights would give Bell Rock Holdings full control over transit through the southern corridor," Ilara said, "including the right to set toll rates, restrict or redirect traffic, and, in the event of what the document calls land underutilization, to initiate purchase proceedings at assessed value." She looked at the room. Assessed value is determined by Bell Rock Holdings' own surveyors, not market value, not a negotiated price. The room's texture changed. She could feel it, the way attention sharpens when something that was abstract becomes specific. "Who are you?" a man near the front said, not hostilely, genuinely asking. "Ilara Quinn. I've been staying at Blackstone Ridge." She moved toward the center of the room, where people could see her. "I've spent the past 2 weeks talking with the landholders in the corridor. Sven Lindqvist, Ren Calder, Consolata Varga, Fergus McRae, the Norris family. They've all had unusual difficulties in the past 6 months. Livestock losses that don't track with weather or predators. Supply disruptions. And visits from Bell Rock representatives offering prices that seemed generous until you understood why the company needed those particular parcels. "This is speculation," Crane said. His voice was still controlled, but something had shifted behind it. "The camp on Gideon Voss's eastern ridge isn't speculation," Ren Calder said from the back. "I've seen the boot impressions myself." "The blocked creek intake on my land isn't speculation," Sven Lindqvist added. "The alterations to Consolata Varga's title records," Ilara said, and now her voice was quieter, which somehow made it carry further, "aren't speculation either." She reached into the leather case she'd been carrying and removed 2 documents. She held them up where the room could see. "This is Varga's original filing from 7 years ago, and this is the version in the current registry as it appears after Bodell Fitch reviewed her records in July." She looked at Fitch directly. "The second document contains a notation that creates a gap in her title chain, a gap that happens to make her claim challengeable under the territory's land code, a gap that did not exist in the original." Fitch's face had gone the color of old chalk. The room was very loud for about 10 seconds and then went very quiet. Crane tried twice to regain control of the gathering. The first time, Fergus McRae talked over him with the blunt, carrying voice of a man who'd been shouting across Scottish hillsides since childhood. The second time, Roy Sutter stood on a chair and asked, in a voice of genuine civic authority, whether anyone present had any additional documentation related to Bell Rock Holdings' activity in the territory that they'd like to enter into the gathering's official record. 4 people raised their hands. It was not, from that point, a short afternoon. What happened in the middle of all of it? The arguments, the documentation, the moment when 2 of Crane's allies slipped out the back and the room noticed, and the noticing made everything worse for the men who stayed, was that Gideon Voss walked to the center of the warehouse floor and asked for quiet. He got it, because he was Gideon Voss, and the room had learned over the years that when he chose to speak it was worth hearing. He stood there with the particular quality he had of occupying space without forcing it, and he looked around at the faces he'd been studiously avoiding for 3 years, and he said what he'd stayed up the previous night working out. "This valley is not pieces of land, Fuso-san," he said. "It's a corridor. It's worth 10 times what any one of us knows, and someone from Farnell figured that out before any of us did, and he's been spending the past year making it hard enough to hold that we'd sell without understanding what we were giving up. He paused. The people in this room who've been working with Harlan Crane, you can make your own judgments about their reasons. But the people in this room who've been working the land out here, you need to know what you're sitting on. And you need to know that the only way it stays yours is if you hold it together. A silence that had weight to it. Then he turned and looked at Alara, who was standing near the wall with the document still in her hands, and who was watching him with an expression he'd learned by now to read. The careful, measuring look she wore when something surprised her. She came here because someone told her the corridor was in trouble, he said. She came on her own, without a plan or a guarantee or any reason to expect it to go well. She spent 2 weeks in the cold writing to every landholder in the corridor and listening to them and telling them the truth about what they had. He held her gaze across the room. That's the kind of person I've been waiting for. The room went through a brief, collective confusion. People looked at him, then at Alara, then back at him. Someone whispered something to someone else. He walked across the room to where she stood. His heart was going harder than he'd like, and his face was probably doing something he didn't have full control over, which was unusual for him and not entirely comfortable. She watched him come. Her chin was up slightly. She had the look of someone who was not going to make this easy or sentimental, because she didn't do things that way, and honestly it was one of the things about her. I haven't asked you properly, he said, low enough that it was between them rather than the room. No, she agreed. You haven't. I'm asking now. A pause. Outside, the wind moved through the gap between the buildings, a thin, cold sound. You're doing it in front of a room full of people, she said. I know. He looked at her steadily. But it's your decision and you should make it with the full picture. That's what you told Ren Calder. A beat. I learned that from you. Something moved through her expression, quick and complicated and not easy to name. Her jaw did the slight set that meant she was thinking hard, and then it released. All right, she said. Yes. The room erupted. Not in celebration exactly. It was more complicated than that, the way most real things are. There were people who were genuinely glad, and people who were confused, and people who resented the whole situation, and people who'd expected Gideon Voss never to choose anyone and were now revising their understanding of the man, which was uncomfortable and which some of them were going to be difficult about. And before the eruption had properly settled, before anyone had figured out what they were supposed to feel about what they'd just witnessed, the warehouse doors opened. The men who came through them were not settlers. They were not traders. They had the look of men who'd been waiting outside for a signal that had not come when it was supposed to, and who'd decided to stop waiting. There were 7 of them. They came in hard, with purpose, and the room that had been loud went suddenly and completely silent. At the back of the group, dressed like a man who'd made a very considered decision to be somewhere other than the front of violence, was a figure who hadn't been in the room before. Well-dressed, middle-aged, with the particular expression of a man who believes that all situations are ultimately negotiable and is now recalculating whether this one is. Gideon looked at the men in the doorway. Then he looked at Alara. Her eyes had already moved past the armed men and found the figure at the back. She'd already understood who he was. She looked back at Gideon, and in the flat, clear look she gave him, he read everything he needed to. Aldous Reeve had decided that if he couldn't buy the corridor, he was going to take it. The first thing Gideon did was step in front of Alara. It was instinct rather than calculation, and she would have objected to it under different circumstances. But she let it go because the situation didn't leave room for that argument, and she was already doing something else, moving her eyes around the warehouse, counting exits, reading the body language of the 7 men in the doorway. The room had gone the particular kind of still that happens when a large group of people simultaneously recognize danger and haven't yet decided what to do about it. Children were pulled close. A few men near the walls put their hands on tools or furniture without quite reaching for them. Roy Sutter, on his chair, had gone rigid. The lead mercenary was a broad man with a close-cropped beard and the flat professional expression of someone for whom this was work rather than excitement. He didn't draw anything. He didn't need to. The implication was sufficient, and he understood that. He surveyed the room with the slow confidence of a man who'd walked into crowds before and found them manageable. Nobody needs to get hurt, he said. We're here to witness the signing of land transfer documents, that's all. Documents that don't exist yet, Alara said from behind Gideon's shoulder. The lead man found her. They'll exist shortly. Will they? Her voice was level. Because the gathering just spent the last hour documenting evidence of fraud against 3 territory landholders. That's now part of the official record. She paused. Anything signed in this room today, under these circumstances, is going to be contested in every territorial court from here to the capital. And the men who witnessed the signing will be asked to testify about how voluntary it was. She was talking to the room as much as to the mercenaries. She could feel it. The way people were listening, the way the framing of what was happening was still being established. Whoever named the situation first had an advantage. Aldous Reeve, at the back of the mercenary group, stepped slightly forward. He was shorter than he'd looked from across the room, and older, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder without quite losing the habit of charm. "Miss Quinn," he said, "we've not been introduced." "No," she said, "we haven't." "You've done impressive work," he said, and he meant it in the way powerful men mean compliments, as a way of reducing something threatening to something manageable. "But you've been working with incomplete information. The land transfers I'm proposing are entirely legal and genuinely beneficial." "Then you don't need armed men to witness them," Sven Lindqvist said from the left side of the room. Reeve looked at him. "I brought security because I was told the situation might be contentious." "Who told you that?" Roy Sutter asked. He'd gotten down from the chair. His voice had the quality of a man who was angry in a direction that was going to be hard to redirect. "Who in this town told you to bring armed men to a community gathering?" A silence. Reeve looked at Crane. Crane looked at the floor. It was a small moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, but the room read it with the accuracy that crowds develop when they're paying close attention. The sound that moved through the warehouse was not loud, but it was not friendly either. Gideon had used those seconds to take stock of what he had. The warehouse had 3 exits. The main doors behind the mercenaries, a side door to the left that opened onto the alley between the freight office and the feed store, and a loading door at the far back that was currently barred from inside. Most of the women and children were in the center and right side of the room. The men who'd been near Crane were now noticeably separate from him, which meant they'd made a calculation about which side of the situation they wanted to be on. He had Sven Lindqvist on his left, who was 60-something and compact and had worked his land with his hands for 20 years. He had Fergus McRae against the back wall, who was red in the face in the way of a man who would make excellent decisions or very bad ones depending on the next 30 seconds. He had Roy Sutter, who was not a fighter but who commanded the room's respect in a way that was its own kind of leverage. And he had 7 armed men between him and the only unobstructed exit. He leaned back slightly and spoke quietly, without turning his head. The loading door. "Barred," Alara said, equally quiet. "I know, the bar lifts from either side. Who's nearest to it?" A beat. "Ren Calder, 8 feet. Can she reach it without crossing the open floor?" "Along the wall, yes." "I need 30 seconds. "I can give you 45, she said. "Maybe a minute." He didn't ask how. He'd stopped being surprised by what she could do with a room. Alara stepped around him and moved toward the center of the floor, and the lead mercenary watched her come with the attention of a man recalculating. "I want to talk to Reeve directly," she said. "No intermediaries, just the 2 of us." She looked past the mercenaries at Reeve. "You're a businessman. You want the corridor. I understand why. It's worth taking. But you've made a fundamental error in how you've gone about getting it. And if you don't understand what that error is, today is going to cost you far more than the corridor is worth." Reeve studied her. Despite everything, he was curious. That was the thing about intelligent bad men. They couldn't fully suppress their interest in a problem, even when the problem was working against them. "What error?" he said. "You assumed the individual landholders were the obstacle," she said. "They're not. The corridor's value isn't in the individual parcels. It's in the route. And the route only stays viable if the community that surrounds it functions. You destroy the community trying to take the land, and you've got a trade route through hostile country that no one's going to use." She moved another step closer, drawing his focus fully to her. "You've been building this for 4 years in 2 other territories. How's the toll operation going in Marsh County? Are the settlers cooperating? Are the traders taking the longer route to avoid your checkpoints? Something shifted in Reeves' expression. Not much, but enough. At the far end of the warehouse, without any sound worth naming, Ren Calder reached the loading door. You know about Marsh County, Reeves said. Verna Alcott does a lot of trading, Alara said. She talks to people. Verna Alcott, he repeated, and something like genuine irritation crossed his face. That woman. The loading door bar came free with a single sharp sound, and the door opened, and October came in cold and immediate, and everything happened at once. Ma'am. Gideon moved the moment the door opened, not toward the mercenaries, toward the right side of the room, where the families were clustered. Side door, he said, loud and clear, without shouting. Single file, children first, move now. The room had been coiled for it. People moved. The lead mercenary turned toward the noise and confusion, and in that turn, lost the thing he'd walked in with, the psychological high ground of being the only people in the room with a clear intention. Crowds are manageable when they're still. In motion, even a large group of armed men has trouble. Roy Sutter had the side door open in seconds. Women and children went through it in a stream, not panicked, moving fast. Sven Lindqvist positioned himself beside the door and did what large, solid men do in doorways, which is make it harder for anyone to close it. Fergus McRae had moved to the loading door and was through it and gone before the mercenaries fully understood there were now 2 exits in play. What the lead mercenary did was look at Reeve. And Reeve, who was a businessman rather than a fighter, and who was watching the situation decohere in a way he hadn't planned for and couldn't recalculate fast enough, made the mistake of looking uncertain. That was when Gideon came back through the room. He wasn't moving fast. He moved with the particular economy of someone who doesn't waste effort, which looked slow until you realized how much ground he was covering. The lead mercenary put a hand up. Gideon took the hand at the wrist, stepped inside the reach, and removed him from the conversation with the blunt efficiency of someone who'd handled large animals in difficult terrain for 11 years and understood that force applied correctly didn't require anger. The man went down hard, not unconscious, but informed. 2 of the other mercenaries moved, and then Fergus McRae came back through the loading door with 2 of the corridor's neighboring landholders behind him, men who'd been waiting in the street and had heard the noise and made their own calculations. The odds in the room shifted in the visible way that odds shift when enough people understand them at the same time. The remaining mercenaries went still. Reeve looked around the room. The crowd that had been his leverage 30 seconds ago had mostly gone through the 2 open doors, and what remained was a collection of men who were not going to sign anything, and who were looking at him with the specific expression of a community that has been pushed past the point where it's interested in being reasonable. This is going to be very bad for you, Reeves said, to no one in particular. Yes, Alara said from behind him. He turned. She was standing near the main doors with the leather case still under her arm, and she had the look of someone who had already moved past this moment and was thinking about what came after it. It is. Would you like to discuss how bad, specifically? The aftermath was neither clean nor quick, which is the honest truth about aftermath. Crane tried to leave through the main doors and found Roy Sutter in the street with 3 men from the gathering committee who had questions for him that were not going to be deferred. Fitch had disappeared sometime during the chaos. He was found the following morning at the South Junction, trying to arrange passage on an eastbound freight wagon, and was returned to Delwater with considerably less dignity than he'd left it. Reeves' mercenaries, deprived of both momentum and instruction, sorted themselves into 2 groups. Those who surrendered the situation with professional detachment, and those who needed Gideon to have another conversation with them before they understood their options. The latter group was small. He was thorough. Reeve himself sat in a chair in the middle of the emptied warehouse for 2 hours, while Alara and Roy Sutter and the gathering committee worked through what had happened and what could be documented and what the territorial law said about it. He was not stupid. He understood that the situation had collapsed completely and that the question now was how much of it he could limit. He answered questions with the careful honesty of a man protecting himself, which meant the answers were partial but not false. And that was enough to work with. What emerged, piece by piece over those 2 hours, was the full shape of what Bellrock Holdings had been doing for the past 18 months, the livestock harassment, The supply road damage, the manipulation of Varga's title records, the pressure on Pryor that had looked like an ordinary sale. It was a careful, patient operation, and it had worked in 2 other territories, and it had very nearly worked here. The Pryor land, Gideon said at one point. What happens to it? The sale may be contestable, Alara said. She was looking at the documents spread across the table, not at Reeve. If Pryor can demonstrate that he was operating under coercion or under a false understanding of the land's value, there are grounds. She paused. It'll take time, and he'll need a good accounting of what happened. I'll get him a good accounting, Roy Sutter said. Gideon looked at Reeve. The Pryor sale is going to be contested, he said. It wasn't a question. Reeve looked at the table. That would be an expensive fight, he said. For both of us, Gideon agreed. But I'm going to have the documents, and you're going to be dealing with everything else coming out of today. And I think you know which of us can sustain an expensive fight better right now. A long silence. I'll instruct Bellrock to release the claim, Reeves said. Sven Lindqvist, standing near the door, let out a breath that he'd probably been holding since morning. Chat. It was dark by the time they rode out of Delwater, and cold in the serious way of October nights that are telling you November is not far behind. Alara was tired in her bones, the kind of tired that comes from holding too many things at once for too many hours and finally being able to put them down. The horse moved under her with the settled, ground-eating pace of an animal that knew it was going home. Gideon rode beside her without speaking for a long while. He had a cut above his left eyebrow from the second mercenary conversation, which he'd addressed with a rag and hadn't mentioned. She'd noticed it and also hadn't mentioned it, because now wasn't the moment, and he would have been annoyed by the fuss. Varga's title record, he said eventually. Can we actually fix it? Yes, the original filing is clear. We present both documents to the territorial registrar with a written account of what Fitch did and when. It'll take a few weeks to process, but her claim will be clean. She shifted in the saddle. McRae's going to be impossible about this for a while. McRae's always impossible. He's going to be impossible in a specific direction now. He'll decide he knew something was wrong all along and that he was the one who handled it. She paused. Let him. It costs us nothing, and it'll make him easier to work with. Gideon was quiet for a moment. When did you start thinking about working with him long term? It was a precise question, and she took it precisely. Somewhere around the second hour at his kitchen table, she said. He's stubborn, but he's not dishonest, and the corridor's going to need stubborn before it's stable. He nodded slowly. Above them, the stars were coming out in the cold, clear sky, the Milky Way beginning to show at the edges where the horizon was fully dark. What you said to Reeve, Gideon said. About Marsh County, about the route becoming hostile territory. He glanced at her. You were partly making it up. I knew about Marsh County, she said. I didn't know the specifics. I extrapolated. In the middle of all that. It was a reasonable extrapolation. He looked at the trail ahead. Yes, he said. It was. Another long quiet. The horses found their way in the dark with the confidence of animals that had done this trail many times. And the valley below was a darkness, with the creek running through it faintly visible where it caught the starlight. I meant it, he said. What I said in the room. I know you did, she said. I want to make sure you know I knew what I was saying. It wasn't the moment getting ahead of me. He was looking at the trail still, which was how he said things that were difficult to say, with his eyes somewhere else, his voice careful. I've been alone in that valley for 11 years, and I was all right with that. And then you came and I stopped being all right with it, and that's not a small thing for me. She was quiet for a moment. The cold moved around them both. An August breath steamed, and somewhere far up the ridge an owl made its 2-note sound. I know it's not small, she said. Her voice was steady, but something in it had gone gentler than usual. It's not small for me either. She paused. I came here because Verna told me someone needed to know about the corridor. That was true. It was also true that I'd been looking for a reason to go somewhere that mattered and hadn't found one, and I wasn't ready to say that out loud. She looked at him sideways. So I came with a practical reason and a less practical one, and the practical one worked out, and now here we are. Here we are, he said. The cabin came into view below. The dark shape of it, solid against the valley floor, the stone foundation and the two-story structure, and the root cellar and the orchard bare branched to the east. His. Built piece by piece out of difficult land in 11 years, and the conviction that something worth having was worth the work of having it. He looked at it the way he always looked at it coming home in the dark, with the particular feeling of a thing being in the right place. And then he looked at Alara beside him, riding the stubborn mare without complaint through a cold October night after the longest day either of them had had in a long while, with her chin up and her eyes forward, and that expression she wore when she was already thinking about the next thing. The feeling was the same. That was what he understood, coming down the last section of trail toward home. The same feeling, exactly. They put the horses up together and went inside, and the cabin was cold from a day without a fire. And they built one, and the warmth came back into the space the way warmth does, gradually and then all at once, and then it was simply there, which was the best thing it could be. The territorial registrar's office was in a town called Havelock, 3 days' ride southeast of Delwater, and Alara made the trip alone in the first week of November. Gideon had offered to come. She'd told him the cattle needed someone on the ridge more than she needed company on a bureaucratic errand, and that was true. But it was also true that she needed the 3 days to think without the particular distraction of his presence, which she was still adjusting to and wasn't ready to admit was a distraction at all. She took August, who had decided weeks ago that Alara was acceptable, and expressed this by being only mildly difficult rather than actively obstructive. And she rode south through the narrowing corridor land with the survey documents and Consolata Varga's filing records in the leather case, and a list of everything that needed to be formally corrected, contested, or documented. Or Baska. The ride gave her time to look at the land the way she'd looked at it on that first morning from the rise above Gideon's Valley, with the eyes of someone trying to understand what a thing actually was, rather than what it appeared to be. The corridor was beautiful in November, the pines dark against the pale sky, the creek running low and cold, the rock faces of the ridges showing their full structure now that the summer vegetation had died back. It was hard country. It asked things of you continuously and gave back in its own time and on its own terms. She understood, riding through it, why Gideon had never left. And she understood something else, something she'd been circling for weeks without quite landing on, which was that she hadn't come here only for the corridor, and she hadn't come only because Verna Alcott had told her someone needed to know. She'd come because she'd spent 6 years after her father's land was lost doing careful, practical things in careful, practical ways, keeping herself useful and kept. And at some point, useful and kept had started to feel like a very slow way of disappearing. She'd wanted to go somewhere that required her full self, not just the parts that were easy to hand over. She hadn't known that was what she wanted until she was already here, which was probably the only way she would have admitted it. The registrar in Havelock was a precise, unhurried woman named Adela Marsh, who reviewed the Varga documents with the focused attention of someone who had seen a great deal of creative paperwork in her career and had developed strong feelings about it. She spread both versions of the filing across her desk and looked between them for a long time without speaking. The notation in the second version, she said finally, was added after the original stamp date. Yes, Alara said. The ink is a different composition, slightly darker, different oxidation pattern. You can see it clearly if you hold it to the window. Adela held it to the window. She was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need the name of the man who made this alteration. Bodil Fitch. He was the title recorder in Delwater. He's no longer in that position. Alara paused. He's currently in Delwater pending a formal inquiry by the gathering committee. Pending? Adela set the document down. That's a gentle word for what this is. The committee is being thorough, Alara said. They want it to hold up. Adela looked at her over the desk. And the other irregularities you mentioned in your letter? The prior transfer? The access rights proposal? Alara opened the leather case. I have documentation for all of it. Timeline, witness accounts, the original Bell Rock Holdings proposal as it was presented to the gathering committee. She set the papers on the desk in the order she'd organized them, which told the story clearly if you followed it from the beginning. Reeve has agreed in writing to release the prior claim. That agreement is at the back. Adela picked up the agreement and read it carefully. Then she set it down and looked at Alara with an expression that was professional and also something more than professional. "How long did this take you?" she said. "About 3 weeks from when I arrived to the gathering," Alara said. "The documentation took another 2 weeks after." "3 weeks," Adela repeated. She said it the way people say things they're filing away for future reference. "All right, Miss Quinn, let's go through this properly." They spent 4 hours in that office. Adela asked precise questions and Alara answered them precisely. And by the end of it, the Varga title record had been formally corrected. The prior transfer was flagged for a contested review, and a formal inquiry into Bodell Fitch's conduct had been opened at the territorial level, which meant it was no longer just a Delwater problem. Harlan Crane's involvement was documented separately, referred to the territory's civil authority with a recommendation that his assay license be reviewed. Walking out of the registrar's office into the cold Havelock afternoon, Alara stood on the steps for a moment and breathed the sharp air and felt something she hadn't felt in 6 years, which was the specific satisfaction of a thing being in its right place. Not finished. These things were never truly finished. The paperwork would take months. The Fitch inquiry would be contested. The prior review would be complicated. But in its right place, moving in the right direction. Her father's land had moved in the wrong direction, and she'd been too young and too poorly positioned to stop it. She had never entirely stopped thinking about that. She started thinking about it less after that afternoon in Havelock. She came back to the ridge in the second week of November, with the first real snow 2 days behind her and catching up fast. Gideon was at the fence line on the south pasture when she came down the trail, doing the kind of repair work that expanded indefinitely in the way fence repairs do, and he looked up when he heard August on the trail and watched her come down with an expression she was starting to know well, the one where he was feeling something clearly and showing it barely, the small adjustments in his face that were his version of what other people did with their whole bodies. "How did it go?" he said. "Well," she reined in beside him. "Varga's title is clean. Fitch has a territorial inquiry. The prior review is open." She looked at him. "Reeves' agreement will hold. Adela Marsh has a copy, and she's the kind of woman who follows up on things." He nodded slowly. "The Norris family had another visit," he said. "Man came to their door 3 days ago, different name, different company, same offer. Reeves pulling back, but someone else is watching," she said. It didn't surprise her. Word traveled in these territories, and a corridor that had been identified as valuable by one operator would be identified by others. "We need to formalize the landholders' arrangement before spring. Something documented, a collective land agreement, mutual easement rights, something that makes it legally complicated to approach any one of us individually." "Roy Sutter has been talking to a lawyer in Farnell about exactly that," Gideon said. "Man named Galt. Roy thinks he can draft something workable." She looked at him. "You've been busy." "You were gone for 2 weeks," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I had time to think." August stamped and blew, impatient with standing still after 3 days of moving. Alara swung down, and the horse immediately dropped her head to investigate the fence post, which was not edible but which she felt deserved examination anyway. "McRae came up last week," Gideon said, "to talk about the agreement." "McRae came to you." "He came to both of us. I told him you were in Havelock, and he said he'd come back." Gideon paused. "He also said, and I want to be clear that his exact words were, 'I suppose she knows what she's doing,' which is probably the closest he gets to an apology. From McRae, that's practically a declaration of affection. I told him that. He denied it vigorously." She laughed, the real kind, surprised out of her. And Gideon's face did the thing it did when she laughed, the shift she'd been watching for longer than she'd admitted. They walked the fence line together in the thin winter light, August trailing behind them with the resigned patience of a horse who understood that humans sometimes needed to walk places instead of riding and had made a kind of philosophical peace with it. The wedding happened in December, 10 days before the solstice, in the Delwater freight warehouse that had last been the site of something far more chaotic. It was not a large event by anyone's choice. Alara had no family in the territory, and the idea of a performance of celebration had never appealed to her. Gideon's position on large gatherings was well established. What they ended up with was the corridor landholders and their families, Roy Sutter, May Holloway, Ren Calder, Consolata Varga, who came down from her bench in the mountains with a jar of preserved plums and the expression of a woman who has seen enough of life to know when something is worth attending. Sven Lindqvist cried, which nobody who knew him expected, and which Britta claimed to have no prior knowledge of. Fergus McRae stood in the back with his arms crossed, and a look on his face that could have been disapproval, or could have been the face of a man who has not cried in 40 years and is engaged in a vigorous internal negotiation about whether to continue that record. He congratulated them afterward with a handshake for Gideon and a nod for Alara that contained, if you were paying close attention, considerable warmth. May Holloway told Alara privately, before the ceremony, that she'd known from the first day. Alara thanked her, and did not ask what exactly she'd known, because May's certainty about things she'd only glimpsed was a quality best accepted rather than examined. It was a short ceremony. No one said much beyond what needed to be said. Alara wore the dark gray wool dress she'd arrived in, which was the best dress she had, and which she'd taken the hem down on and cleaned carefully. And Gideon wore a jacket that fit him well, and that he'd clearly not worn in some time based on the particular way he kept adjusting the collar. She told him about the collar later. He said he was aware. She said she could see that. He said it had been 11 years since he'd needed the jacket, and she said she understood, and he said he thought maybe they should eat something, and they did. The preserved plums from Consolata were extraordinary, dense and sweet and sharp all at once. The taste of a whole summer concentrated into something that kept. Alara ate 3 and thought that was the kind of thing a person could spend years learning to do well, the careful preservation of something worth keeping. He said, winter settled over the valley hard and early that year, the kind of winter that tests the quality of everything you've built. The drainage system held against the freeze. The cattle came through to the south pasture before the upper slopes became impassable, because Alara had been watching the weather signs for a week, and had told Gideon they needed to move the herd 4 days before he would have judged it necessary. He moved the herd. The upper slope froze solid 2 days later. He didn't say anything about it. She didn't point it out. That was how it worked between them. Not a scorekeeping, but a gradual accumulation of understanding about who saw what and when and why. The kind of knowledge that takes time and proximity and the willingness to be occasionally wrong in front of another person. He was wrong about the drainage culvert on the North Creek in February, which he'd judged sound and which she'd suggested looking at more carefully, and which failed during a midwinter thaw and flooded a section of the lower pasture. He fixed it in a cold and filthy day of work that left him mud-covered and short-tempered, and she made food and didn't editorialize, and by evening he said that she'd been right about the culvert, and she said she'd been right about the culvert but wrong about how fast the thaw would come, so they'd both had a difficult day. And he'd looked at her for a moment and then laughed in the way he occasionally laughed, reluctantly, like it had gotten out before he could decide about it. And that was that. They were not two people who had found each other and become better versions of themselves. They were two people who had found each other and were now navigating the ordinary difficulty of being themselves in close proximity, which required constant small adjustments and occasional larger ones, and the ongoing willingness to distinguish between the things worth fighting about and the things worth letting go. She had strong opinions about the organization of the tool shed. He had strong opinions about it too, and they were different opinions. This was the subject of the only real argument they had that winter, which lasted 2 days and resolved not because either of them fully conceded, but because they found a third arrangement that was worse than either of their original positions in different ways, which somehow made both positions seem more reasonable. And they went back to a compromise that leaned slightly toward hers because she was right about access frequency, and he eventually admitted it. He was better at silence. She was better at asking the question that needed to be asked. He knew the land's moods in winter better than anyone she'd met. She could read a person's hesitation the way he read tracks, the direction of it, the weight behind it, the story it was trying not to tell. What they were building was not a romance in the way stories describe romance, with its clean arcs and timed revelations. It was something more specific and more durable than that. It was a working partnership between two people who had spent most of their lives relying primarily on themselves, and who were now, with considerable care and occasional frustration, learning to rely on something larger. What? The collective land agreement was signed in March, at the first gathering of the new year, with the lawyer Galt from Farnell present to answer questions and Roy Sutter present to make sure everyone understood what they were signing. All 6 quarter landholders were there. Even Consolata Varga, who came down the mountain in the mud of early spring thaw and signed her name in handwriting that was small and precise and final. The agreement established mutual easement rights across all 6 parcels, created a shared registry of land improvements, and the provision that Alara had spent the most time on required that any offer to purchase a corridor parcel be disclosed to all other signatories before any response was given. Not a refusal of sale, just disclosure. The right to know what was being offered and why, so that no one made a decision in the vacuum that isolation creates. That provision was Alara's. She'd written the language herself, 3 drafts over 2 weeks, because she knew what it was like to watch a decision be made in a vacuum, to watch someone accept an offer they didn't understand because they had no way of seeing what they were part of. Her father had not had that. She was making sure these people did. Gideon watched her at the signing, the way she moved through the room, answering questions, explaining the easement language to the Norris family in terms that made it concrete, standing slightly to the side while Galt walked through the formal provisions, watching the room the way she always watched rooms. She was not comfortable being the center of things. She never would be. But she was present in a way that most people weren't, fully there, attending to what was actually happening rather than the version of it she'd prefer. He thought about the morning she'd arrived in his yard with a worn bag and noticed his axe. He thought about what he'd been, that morning, a man so accustomed to his own company that he'd stopped being able to imagine anything different. Not unhappy exactly, but narrowed. The way a creek narrows in drought, still moving but running in a smaller channel than it was built for. He was not going to say that to her, because it was the kind of thing that if he said it, she'd give him a look and ask whether he'd been reading novels. But he thought it, and knowing it was enough. After the signing, walking out into the March light with the mud of the thaw soft under their boots, Sven Lindqvist fell into step beside them and said, in the particular way he said things that had weight to him, "My father used to say that the land doesn't care who thinks they own it. It only cares who understands it." Alara looked at him. What did he mean by that? He meant that ownership is just paperwork. Sven looked out at the valley, the corridor visible in its full shape from the small rise above Delwater, the 6 parcels flowing into each other like the segments of a single thing. Understanding is something you have to earn. He paused. You earned it. He said it to both of them, but he was looking at Alara when he said it. She looked at the valley. The snow was gone from the lower slopes, the first pale green of early grass beginning to show along the creek. The upper ridges still held winter, white against the blue sky, but their edges were softening. "I'm still learning it," she said. "Good," Sven said. "The day you think you've finished is the day it starts to get away from you." By summer, the corridor had changed in ways that were not dramatic but were real. The supply road damage had been repaired, properly, with road graders and rockfill, funded through a small collective assessment that all 6 landholders had agreed to because they understood now what the road was worth. The eastern ridge above Gideon's Valley was quiet. No more cold fire rings, no more moving lights. Whoever Reeve had left in the territory had found better prospects elsewhere, or had understood that this particular corridor was no longer soft ground. The Pryor claim review resolved in late summer in Pryor's favor. He did not come back to the territory. He'd put down roots in Ohio, and his daughter was expecting a child, and he was, by all accounts, content. But the settlement gave him a fair accounting of what had been taken from him, and the land came back into the corridor registry, available for sale under the new agreement's terms. A young family from the eastern settlements bought it in September. A couple with 2 children and a third on the way, who'd made the trip west looking for exactly what the corridor was. Hard land that asked something of you and gave something real back. Gideon rode out to meet them when they arrived. He showed them the drainage system on the South Creek and the best grazing lines on the upper slope and where the supply road washed out every spring and how to get ahead of it. He did not offer advice on anything they hadn't asked about because he understood what it was to need to learn a place in your own time, but he made sure they knew where to find him if they needed something. Alara was in the orchard when he came back, thinning the late summer growth with the careful attention she'd been giving the trees since spring, learning their particular habits and needs the way she'd learned everything since arriving, by paying closer attention than the situation seemed to require, until the situation revealed why it had required it. "They seem good," he said. She looked up. "Are they going to be all right out there?" "They're going to have a hard first winter," he said honestly, "but they're prepared for it. And they know the others in the corridor. He paused. They'll be all right. She went back to the tree she was working on, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over a summer of learning what the orchard needed. The afternoon light came through the branches at a low angle, the particular light of late summer that makes everything look like it's being seen for the last time before the season turns, which is the light's way of making you pay attention. Wren's coming to dinner Saturday, she said. She's bringing McRae, which I didn't arrange, and she says she didn't arrange, so we'll see how that goes. McRae and Wren called her, Gideon said. Yes. A pause. I know, she said. Does he know? He doesn't know anything. That's the entire situation. She moved to the next branch. Wren knows, I think, but she's not going to rush anything. She's not that kind of person. Gideon leaned against the fence post at the orchard's edge and looked up through the trees at the sky, which was the deep, clear blue of late summer at elevation. He thought about two people who had each been alone a long time, circling the possibility of something different. Sometimes people need someone to come along and tell them what they're sitting on, he said. She stopped working and looked at him. He was looking up through the trees, his face in profile, the late light on the side of his face that was toward the south. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She understood what he meant because she knew how he thought, not in speeches or declarations, but in parallels, in one thing that stood for another thing, in the patient, indirect way of a man who'd spent 11 years learning to say only what he meant, which meant learning to mean things precisely. She went back to the tree. Saturday dinner, she said. You're making the beans. I always make the beans. Because your beans are better than mine. Yes, he said. They are. See, she said, that's the kind of honesty I came here for. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, and the orchard held its late summer light around them both, and the valley lay in its long quiet below the ridges that had always been there and would be there long after everyone in this story was gone. The creek and the cattle and the drainage system and the new road and the collective agreement in the Havelock Registry and all the small, unspectacular evidence of people who had decided to understand the thing they were part of rather than simply use it. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world being overlooked, not because they are small, but because they don't perform themselves, don't arrange their qualities for display, or announce their worth before it's been demonstrated. The world has trouble valuing what it can't immediately see, and so it waits, and in the waiting often loses exactly the thing it most needed. Elara Quinn had spent 31 years being that kind of person. She knew what it cost. She knew the specific exhaustion of being underestimated not out of malice, but out of inattention, which is in some ways harder to carry because there's no one to be angry at. She knew what it was to have something to offer and be given no opening to offer it. What she had not known, until she rode into a valley that needed exactly what she carried, was that the right place has a way of making itself clear. Not easily, not without cost, but clearly. Gideon Voss had looked at 10 women who arrived carrying expectations and had turned them all away because he could feel the weight of what other people had decided he needed pressing through every smile and every careful presentation. He had been waiting, without quite knowing he was waiting, for someone who arrived with their own reasons, their own clear sight of what was here and what it was worth and what it would take to keep it. He had been waiting, it turned out, for someone who would look at a valley and see not what she wanted from it, but what it was. The autumn came as it always did, with the light changing first and then the temperature, the upper ridges going gold and then bare. The cattle moved down from the summer pastures, the root cellars stocked and the winter preparations made with 2 pairs of hands instead of 1. The work was the same as it had always been, hard and seasonal and continuous, asking more in some years than others, giving back in its own time. What was different was everything else. Not loudly, not in this way of stories that end with something announced, in the way that real things change, through daily accumulation, through small decisions made consistently in the same direction, through the gradual deepening of something that started as necessity and became, without a moment you could point to, indispensable. The man who had refused 10 brides had not been too proud, or too cold, or hiding a dark secret. He had simply known, in the inarticulate way that people know the things most important to them, that a person chosen for you is not the same as a person you choose, and that the difference, which looks small from the outside, is in fact the entire thing. And the woman nobody watched arrive, The one who came with mud on her boots and a worn bag and eyes that missed nothing, had not saved the frontier through some extraordinary quality that set her apart from ordinary people. She had saved it through the same qualities that had always made her who she was: attentiveness, honesty, the willingness to say what she saw and act on what she knew, and stay when it would have been easier to go. She had simply, finally, been in a place that knew how to use her. That is the kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. It feels like the beginning of something long and difficult and worth every part of the difficulty, which is exactly what it was.